Hi, welcome to the Georgia Ramble. This is a special episode of the Rorschach, Georgia Update. Every now and then, we'll put out a special show that includes a more or less unedited conversation with a guest or two, a discussion about whatever pops into our heads, or in this case, something extremely relevant to the country, the recent parliamentary elections. In this episode, we'll sit down and talk with Irinka Mamulashvili and Hans Gutbrod to figure out what happened in those elections, how we know they were stolen, what to do now.
Gutbrod, Georgia, this is the Rorschach Ramble discussing the recent parliamentary elections. Elections by their nature are free and fair. These were not, so it's kind of hard to call them an election, but they were sort of a big national event that has allowed Otsneba, or the Georgian Dream, to pretend to itself and its supporters that they are a democratically and legitimately elected ruling party that they can form a government, but they are not. And we have that information thanks to the hard work of Hans Gutbrot and of ISFED. We have with us somebody who works for ISFED, but is not in this podcast representing ISFED, so she can say whatever she wants. Some of it may be things that ISFED would say. Some of it may not be. Her name is Irinka Mamulashvili. She has worked for ISFED for some time, has also worked in the European Parliament on the candidacy of Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. She has focused on confiscation of Russian assets and aid in rebuilding Ukraine, and she has a master's degree in diplomacy and foreign policy from City University in London. We also have with us Hans Gutbrot, who has a PhD from LSE. He's written a bunch of books and a bunch of other things. He's been in Georgia for a very long time. He knows a lot about statistics, history, all sorts of social sciences, all around smart guy and friend of mine and a good friend of Georgia's. He is also responsible for the much read and discussed Dozen Daggers report about these elections. So we will get going on this. We're going to start out talking about the evidence that the election was stolen. Then we're going to talk about how it was stolen. Obviously, these two things are connected, but those are in some ways two different conversations. And then we're going to talk about what next. So the first piece of data that we're going to start into, and I'll skip the introduction so we can get to the fun part, is that 48 Otsneba, or the Georgian Dream, received 48% of the vote in 2020 and 54% in 2024, which is an additional 192,000 votes, which seems extremely unlikely if it was a free, fair, and non-coerced election. And so we want to keep that in mind, that that's a heck of a lot of votes. And essentially, this was outsourced to different precincts, as they were back in the Shevardnadze days, where they'd say to this Gamgabeli or Gambielbo, all right, this is how many votes we're going to need here and this and that. The next piece of evidence we have that the elections were stolen are the exit polls. And the exit polls, which were released early on in the day, were very different than the eventual outcome. There's a lot of people excited about them when they came out in the afternoon, and then a lot of disappointment afterwards. And so what I would like to ask first Hans and then Irinka about these exit polls is, how is it that the exit polls and the eventual outcomes could have been so different? What are the actual mechanisms by which the exit poll data was gathered, and that the results were so different than the eventual results released by the government-controlled election commission? First, Hans.
Yeah. So first off, the election was rigged, as you pointed out. And what's really important to say is that when elections are rigged comprehensively, that ends up interacting with exit polls in a really, in quite a complicated and not necessarily just a straight linear way. Because the exit poll has certain statistical assumptions about the sampling distribution, how that works in the country. You work out of those. And once you start engaging in mass rigging, they go haywire. And we've seen the one big deviation where they were outside the margin of error was in 2018, the second round of 2018. And we know this was a bad election for multiple reasons, which already showed many of the hallmarks of what went on right now. So let's say the way this can interact is that where there are people from the exit poll, people behave a bit more normally. They do less, there's less shenanigans because there's an observer there. But it also means that the statistical extrapolation doesn't work. So telling that story, it tends to be a fairly complex statistical interaction of various things. The key bit of evidence that really is worth looking at is that though the exit polls were commissioned by the opposition, they have called every single election in the overall result correctly in 2012 also. And this is now the big moment of deviation, which is way outside the margin of error. And that is, by every standard, is a bright red flashing light that something went terribly wrong.
Thank you. Irina, comments on that?
Yeah, definitely. I agree with Hans. The only thing that I can add is that obviously we've seen that there were slight differences between what CC said in previous elections and what we had in exit polls. But for example, the Edison research, which has the most closest data with those of CC, now it had the difference was huge. So obviously it raises questions. Why was that? And that the manipulation that happened raises questions as well. So yeah, definitely this is something that indicates that the elections were rigged.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say it raises questions; it actually answers questions, in as well as a bunch of other data. And interestingly, in the Dozen Daggers report, they mentioned that there was a leaked poll that Otsneba itself had done for itself that said that they were going to lose the elections and gave them the amount that they were going to have to make up by cheating. They couldn't show in the report that data because they couldn't reveal the source. But it was interesting that they had that same information. Moving on, that another thing that was very, very clear was the demographic variance and how minorities there was such a difference in the minority areas, Azeria and Armenian, particularly in the Samskhet-Javakheti area, although in some other areas as well, like north of Tbilisi. So if you can tell us a little bit about how, maybe the minorities were just voting with the government. Certainly they tended to do that in Shevardnadze's period. So how do we know that means that means something specifically to just the demographic variance?
Well, one aspect we didn't cover in our report is the very direct and blatant interference by the Azerbaijani government. And that is very direct foreign interference. But then also in Azerbaijani areas now more with direct shenanigans, the reporting is just very, very extensive. Of the bribery, we cite one of the reports where journalists bravely described all of this happening on the scene. And there we seem to have had a very, very strong sense of bring another vote, get another 100 lari that was going on there. The other aspect, and this is, so there's slightly different things going on between the Azerbaijani areas, the Armenian minority areas. As often happens when things go terribly wrong, there's a kind of blame game. And there has been this, are the minorities there to blame? Or maybe the opposition parties to blame for not sufficiently campaigning? I think in the end, there's just one main culprit. It's on the government to conduct good elections. It's also in the government to create conditions where people can actually campaign. And especially in minority areas, opposition parties say that their members were often intimidated into total submission. So this was what we see as an end result is not necessarily that there was ballot stuffing at huge scale, though ballot stuffing also happened there. It's very important to say, but that it was a really, really bad election that didn't really allow people to form their own will and then to articulate it.
Yeah, there was also, I noticed that you had some really what you call statistical fingerprints, the pattern tests that were done, particularly in the minority areas. This is complicated statistically and not really worth going into, although I encourage everybody to read that report. But there are ways, and these have been used in Iran for Ahmadinejad's second election and the recent elections in Venezuela to tell statistically when the numbers have been manufactured, even though the CEC released very few of them. I wanted to ask a little bit about you mentioned the statistics of Levan Kvirkvelia and Roman Udot. Who are they and what were those? Because those were interesting, and I thought like those compelling scatter plots.
Yeah, so we've seen a part of what we wanted to do with this Dozen Daggers report is synthesize a lot of the very good work that was out there, a lot of the good work by ISFED, work by a WeVote kind of observation that was out there, and also help explain even what was in the ODIHR report, because the way that it's sometimes can be hard to read for people that don't look closely. Now, work we also paid attention to was work by statistical experts. And Kvirkvelia has kind of established it himself as a kind of data analyst. And then Roman Udot is someone who's done very, very extensive work internationally and does these statistical analysis. He's come out with something in the meantime where there's a kind of a slider where you can see what would the result look like if you take the anomalies away. And then it ends up shifting to a very different election result. that in the end certainly doesn't give the absolute majority to the Georgian dream and puts it, in fact, closer to where they originally were according to their own internal polling. Now, I think something to say that's really important is these things are, I would say, strongly indicative. I would not load every single thing with this with the expectation that this is the final piece of evidence, that you always put full proof. This stuff is complicated. You need to kind of check and triple check and quadruple check normally. But the thing to emphasize for people, I think, is look at the full picture. We mentioned exit polls, we mentioned internal polling, we mentioned the trajectory, and then we mentioned all the other observer reports. And so if you take the full picture together, a very, very clear picture of rigged elections emerges.
Mark, can I jump in here quickly about statistics? Because ISFAT noted some unusual patterns in voter turnout, and that would be worth noting. When looking at the turnout rates for men and women, we found some big differences that didn't seem natural. For example, in 62 polling stations, the turnout for male voters and female, male voters, were between 80 to 100%, while women was 57%. And in some instances, there were cases when men voted, there was turnout more than 100%, which means that obviously more men went and voted than there was were registered, right? So it's obviously a natural characteristics. And when we asked CC, we as this had sent an email saying that what is going on here, because many people went, but registered were less than that. And they said that there was some mistake. And when we followed up on that, they said that they cannot provide any data because we already received. If there was a mistake, why you shouldn't change this data and upload the accurate one, right? For example, in Borjomi, let's say 514 people were registered and 599 voted. It's suspicious, right?
And so in those areas where there was the big male-female dichotomy in turnout rates, were those mainly in Azeri villages, or were those, mixed among Georgians, Azeris, and Armenians, or regionally, or what was the story?
Actually, it was not connected to ethnic minority areas. Mainly, it was Bareli, Adigeni, Santvedia, Ninotsmina. Some of them were, but more or less, not all of them. But actually, their pattern is that they were more traditional voting system there, and only one was electronic voting, if it could say something.
Interesting. Yeah, I thought one of the things that you mentioned that either one of you can talk about, but I saw in the Dozen Daggers report, was matching precinct violence reports, which is interesting. So in places where there were reports of violence, how does that vary with others? Now, this is not comprehensive. So as you say, it sets a floor, but that, Otsneba picked up 30 votes per precinct. The opposition lost 41. And that's a big difference. Security problems at the stations would lower the opposition by 53%. And so talk about how were those an on-off switch in terms of the comparison that you'd have, like stations that had a report and those that didn't, or how'd you come up with those numbers?
Yeah. Thanks for picking that up. And important to say, there's 53 votes per precinct on average, rather than 53% in terms of the shift that you just had. So the technique there is an established technique where you do a kind of a like with like comparison, and you look at the demographics, the income levels, the urban rural characteristics. And for every kind of precinct where you identify a problem, you look then at those where a problem was identified by the observer. You look at some where this wasn't identified. And this matching analysis is a very well-established technique that allows us to hone in on particular problems. And again, now the important thing to emphasize is there weren't observers in every place. So we know that there was violence or the threat of very imminent violence in certain places. And with this, we can actually say how much of a difference it made. And then when you take all of this together, you then get an idea of how you could be approaching going from 48%, where normally we would have, as Bidzina Ivanishvili himself said, that he expected support to go down, people to be a bit tired, since he had seen the survey data himself, how you go from, instead of having a decline, how you actually end up adding nearly 200,000 votes, because you took all of these different tools in a kind of multi-pronged assaults and put them together.
A question for Irina. One of the most overwhelmingly compelling parts of the Dozen Daggers was the decision not to randomize the positions in the Electoral Commission and the role that played in people using different IDs. The other one was the translucent ballots that Gila mentioned, and then they did not change, but that was quite obvious to people that you could see how people had voted through the ballot. Those are two very, very important things. And the non-randomized decisions, you could see easily the consequences of those and the translucent ballot. Were there other decisions that the CEC took other than their unwillingness to release significant amount of information after the election? But were there decisions they took before the election that you could see had consequences?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that when we analyze the election, like it's not an isolated event, right? We have to analyze the entire process, and because this process is intertwined, and that's why like pre-election environment matters a lot. And I would say that the results were predetermined, to be honest. And when I say that, I mean that the use of administrative resources that happened. For example, we've seen a lot of public sector employees being forced to attend campaign events during work hours, for example. How would they appear there when they have to be working, right? So these kind of issues were a lot when like more than 300,000 people are working for public sector. It's obviously a lot of number. Also, what we saw that vote bribery that happened, vote buying, which means that not only like giving money, but it was also instances where they gave money. Like
sorry to interrupt. These are things that they did in the election. We're just about to start talking about the method by which they stole the election. I'm talking about specific decisions that the Central Election Commission made before the election, like the positions in the polling station were always randomized in every election since Gamsa.
Yes.
And then they changed it this time. And then we found out afterwards the reason that they changed it was in order to use, so that they could identify the person that would be using ID cards, which they were gathering from people. Translucent ballots. Everybody was saying the ballot is secret. And then as it turns out, the ballot wasn't so secret.
Right.
So are there other decisions made before the election that you could then trace to something that they used in order to steal the election that you can think of?
Definitely. What you mentioned, confiscation of ID cards, for example, this was a big issue that was quite innovative, new, so we captured. And probably that was the innovation and something that they used. Not anything else that I would recall.
All right. Let's then talk about, I have, through this list come up with what I found was sort of the 8 methods that they used. All right. And I, would encourage each of you to add to the list, but I will just go ahead and read down them. So number 1, Irina, as you mentioned, was vote buying around, 120, 130 to 150 lari, 2 people in order to vote odsneba. The fact that that the ballots were translucent was an important aspect of that, of course. Number 2, payment to known opposition supporters to stay home, 100 lari or so, or whatever else. The estimate in the Dozen Daggers report was around 45 million lari, and they went into some details as to how they calculated that, but it could have been significantly more. Now, perhaps coupled with the 100 lari payment, and perhaps not coupled with the 100 lari payment to opposition supporters, was intimidation. Now, keep in mind, a very large portion of Georgians are on Facebook. People post this and that. It's not difficult to know, who they support in one way or another. What was interesting to me is how often their IDs would be taken. And so opposition members would have their IDs taken, and then somebody else would vote with that ID. And my question is, how could somebody else vote with that ID or that ID number in a village where everybody knows each other? Was the Justice House using new IDs issuing new IDs to people who were voting several different times, but it had the numbers of somebody who had begun? I mean, how did that whole system work? And then how did that relate to the Susi and Zveli Bichevi? The Susi meaning the internal state security.
Yeah, Stasi equivalent.
And Zveli Bichevi are these sort of I don't know, it literally means old guys, but it's sort of like the, just sort of local Birzaviki hanger-arounders that are easily controllable and sort of jerks and people are a little afraid of, but they've got nothing better to do and are easy for the government to use to cause problems. And under the national movement, that system was somewhat broken, but they seem to be coming back as an instrument of state power now as they were in Shevardnadze's time. Anyway, sorry, Irina, the question, how is this ID scheme? How did this work?
That's an important one, because when they confiscated IDs, obviously we do not have clear answer on that. But what I can assume why they did so, first of all, about confiscation, and then how this ID thing about with comparing the people who voted. The first thing is that it's really suspicious that opposition lost votes this election compared to previous ones. And where did these votes go, right? Probably in favor of the ruling party. We had the case when we heard from our long-term observer that there was a Ministry of Internal Affairs, someone working for a Ministry of Internal Affairs, and the manager asked him to give 100,000 lari to confiscate his family members' IDs, something like that, because he knew that his family was supporting opposition party. So this could be case why this number was reduced in terms of, for example, UNM. Where did this vote go? It's really suspicious that they just voted for the Georgian Dream instead of voting for the opposition. So this is quite suspicious. Another thing is that these IDs were definitely used by other people. And obviously, this is the thing that commission members were not independent. And when they compare, even there were instances when men voted with the women ID card and, proving that it was him, while it said that it was female, and that the name and surname definitely indicated that that was female and not man. So obviously, this kind of things indicate that there was a big manipulation happening. And yes, also there was a case when these public sector employees were actively contributing to confiscating with family, and they were mainly targeting opposition supporters with this ID confiscation.
Can I just add something to that?
Go ahead, Hans.
Yeah, and this is where the rule change in the CEC about the allocation of roles at the beginning of election day or for election day is so important, because if you know who the people are and if you have can influence that process because there are no observers there, then you can make sure your guy is at the door and your other person is at the door where they're supposed to check the ink, the indelible ink, and the other person's at the ID card kind of scanner and kind of slots you through. And with that, you create the possibility of kind of ushering in people without other people really being able to notice this. And one of the things that many observers noted was that the desks were all the way pushed back to the wall so that the observers couldn't actually verify that the person that was kind of standing there was the person that seemed to be there on the ID. Now, the key thing to emphasize is this is incredibly well orchestrated. There's clear signs of intent. And also, whenever these things were challenged or were highlighted, the government responded with attacking the critics rather than actually being transparent about who voted. We don't know the scale of this issue yet. We definitely know that opposition supporters were offered money for their ID card. What we don't know yet is how many of these ID cards ended up voting for the government. And again, if there's nothing to hide, the government should actually be transparent, but they're doing the exact opposite.
Right. Okay, so just to go over the 8 methods. The fourth one that I have that we've already discussed is a translucent ballots, clear violation of ballot secrecy. The fifth is the lack of random role assignments. Just a quick question there. Before the elections, when they said that they were not going to randomly assign the roles the way they had always done, what reason did they give for that? I mean, was that discussed at all? Did they have a reason for that, or did they just say this will make it easier or something, or what?
Yeah, that's the thing, that they don't have really grounds and excuses and argument justification behind this. They just change it when we raise the questions and when we approach them. They are saying that it's just their free will and they are not violating anything with this, and that they are free to do so. So obviously that's how it works in Georgia. Unfortunately, that sometimes it's not always easy to get some logical answers and from that.
Yeah, and they just sort of dismiss it and say, look, we can do this and who cares and whatever.
Exactly.
Well, and then, and then it's now very obvious, thanks to the work that you've all done, that, that it was with intent. So number 6, ID of opposition supporters were taken, which is just so unimaginably cruel that people would be forced to give up their ID cards and know that their vote was, given to the ruling party. Number 7, the mobile ballot box. That is a box that goes around for people who are immobile, can't move, sick, old, something like that. There were a lot of reports of violations related to that mobile box, which has been a traditional difficulty, particularly back in the Shevardnadze days when, you couldn't, it was difficult for observers to go there because it's technically part of a precinct and you didn't want observers to split and whatever. And then the last thing, number 8, was something that the Dozen Daggers report mentioned and referred to as the snowball method of gathering information and influencing people, which is essentially saying, that people had to designate, report on who they supported a certain number of people that they were connected with. And the people who could be coerced into doing this were, there's 320,000 state employees, 415,000 people on government assistance. There's 340,000 minorities who have always traditionally in Georgia, been in a precarious situation for a government that feels like intimidating them. There's 10,000 people in prisons, 22,000 people on probation. Of course, prisoners and people on probation are easy to influence by saying, things will go well for you if, if this or that happens, or if you can let us know, get us some information here and there. So can you talk a little bit about how this information was gathered and what other, how else this sort of mathematicians and scientists would call it, this social graph of coercion was used in order to throw the election?
Well, if I maybe start, and Irina, I'm sure has many points to add. The messages that I've seen, and these are directly, I've seen them on screens, were typically along the lines that indeed there was a particular entry point that was, if you will, in a vertical where someone is subverted to some kind of employment relationship or vulnerable in a particular way, and that person then was asked again to bring these 10 names in, and 10 seems to be the number that I kept hearing. I heard a little bit of that happening in the past, and this time it was done at scale. And it's very easy to kind of in WhatsApp group or with WhatsApp, with Messenger, etc., to actually collect that. But typically it was really targeting individuals directly and then making those that have in one way or the other have a benefit from being close to the government. That can be in businesses. We heard this about private businesses at scale in Tbilisi also, not just outside Tbilisi. This was what was expected of them. And of course, the implication is or else.
Yeah, I agree with Hans. And also I would add that like voter registration that also happened, like they obviously collected information about people who would go and vote, and voter registration that happened near polling stations, inside and outside. Inside is really suspicious and really concerning, because we had one example, like a person standing and listing people and ticking who came and voted. And when our observer asked her why she's standing there, she said that she's a director of school where this police station was there. So obviously these cases happened a lot. And that's why we had like inside polling station monitoring as well as outside polling station, because, understanding what's happening outside polling station within the perimeter of 100 meters is quite important to understand those kind of things, that there were suspicious gatherings, there were offensive language used against people who voted for opposition. There were some clerics there, people with weapons, these criminal groups. They all were, knew who had to come, who had to vote, whom to vote, etc. And we had some instances when, slide some in pockets money and fuel vouchers and Madagoni vouchers, which is like in Rustavi store vouchers. So those kind of things happened a lot. And also they collected obviously information from a lot of local, as well as, for example, they called me. It was not like collecting information about me, but they called and asked that they knew that I was living in the UK and they knew that I was voting here. I don't know how they got my UK number. I don't know how they got this information, but they asked me if I voted for the Georgian Dream, and if not, why, and whom should I vote? This is something that happened, and I raised.
Who called you?
I don't know. They said that this is like study some kind of center that studies voting behavior. But when they said like Levan, the name was Levan, but I don't remember its surname. And when we all researched it, because it's not only happened with me, but we have this group in London who lives here, and we asked each other, and everyone had the same case.
It's really important to emphasize to people that don't follow Georgia maybe day to day how much this has become a SUSI state, how strong state security has become. It's very difficult to walk through the center of Tbilisi without being captured by cameras anywhere. There are face recognition cameras set up at the entrance to the Georgian Dream rally. The cameras, these are very sophisticated servers that can kind of pick up things. There are cameras in many polling stations. And really, if listeners are interested, they should really look up the evidence that Soso Gogashvili gave about the man that's now in jail, who's kind of a whistleblower. But this went a little bit unnoticed under the radar, how from this being a factor at around 2018-19 to now becoming the factor across institutions and very, very strong in cultural and educational institutions also.
Great. So I think I'm going to wind up with one of my favorite parts here, which is a list of 7 things that Otsneba could do, but is not going to prove that the election wasn't stolen. And it's really quite useful. Number 1 is provide information on who voted, clarify multiple voting and ID card miss was just a marginal issue, offer a full account of the locations and activities, including phone records of SUSI personnel to demonstrate that they can't be linked to intimidation. Number 3, provide a list of regional coordinators, make them available for interviews. 4, invite a comprehensive international audit of Georgia Dream and its associated bank accounts, particularly at Khartoum and Liberty Bank, to demonstrate that Georgia Dream did not spend tens of millions of lari in cash and bribes. 5, publish Georgian Dream's raw pre-election polling data before cleaning and weighing to demonstrate that it actually enjoyed the support that the party claimed it had. 6, open all CEC internal and external correspondence to demonstrate that it took substantive steps to ensure voter privacy, which of course it didn't. 7, welcome and support extensive qualitative and quantitative research, including advanced research techniques such as list experiments undertaken by independent organizations. A very, very helpful list in there of things that are not going to happen. So I want to close in a moment by asking each of you what next. But I wanted to just say about the observation of this that, Irina, you used the term innovation, and there's a lot of innovation in how the elections are subverted. And the government did this in a very well organized way. At the same time, election observation needs to keep up with that. And I think that y'all have done a very good job there. International observers tend to be the worst and the most pointless efforts because they come for a short period of time. And luckily, ODIHR had long-term observers. NDI had long-term observers before the elections, but there's a limit to how much they can find out. Much of this has come to light in the elections and that even Georgians did not know about beforehand in a comprehensive way. And what is important and nice is how this observation effort has really focused statistically on this. And rather than saying, okay, we're going to collect a list of violations, which nobody cares about, what everybody wants to know is, did the subversion of the election influence the outcome? And what you can tell through the variety of tools, some of them are violations of the electoral law and whatever else, other of them are statistical analysis, other of them are extrapolation from finding some violations and presuming what those would mean in other cases. But statistically, it is relatively easy to be clear that this election was thrown, that more people would have voted for the opposition than the ruling party if they had been given the opportunity to and not been coerced out of that. The question that brings to us is, so what does that mean for Georgia right now? We are going to do another podcast about that to look at what that means for Georgia. But I think what we can say is for the international community, that means that Georgia is not a democracy, that the ruling party was not legitimately elected. Now, that's okay. People, deal with North Korea in one way or another. North Korea has a government, not a democratic government, but it is a government, and people have to deal government to government. People are going to have to deal with a Georgian government, but it is important that they recognize that it is not a legitimately elected parliament that is going to be passing legislation in Georgia. The more complicated question is for Georgians themselves. considering that, the control that Susi has, that Hans discussed, considering the danger and the organization of Otsneba in order to take away the will of the people of Georgia, that brings up some hard questions for people. So in closing, if each of you would like to address that, please let us know.
I can start. The first thing is that the situation is really alarming. I would say that democratic institutions are undermined, and not only with the election, but also anti-LGBTQ plus law that is now being adopted and will be enforced from 2nd of December, which is another thing that obviously targets the democratic values such as human rights, minority rights, and educational right as well. Because, like, for example, my mom, she's a professor at university. She teaches art history, and she's no longer available to teach Michelangelo, for example. She had to skip this part, or Andy Warhol or something, which is obviously, this is not democratic. How could we call Georgia democratic when we have this kind of brutal laws and we have this not legitimate parliament, as you said, with no ambassadors attending, no, only the public defender attended and the religious institution representatives, and even the public defender office staff issued a statement saying that they are not supporting the public defender attending this. So obviously, this is something that we saw that's happening in this period. Also, there is the president submitted constitutional appeal to the constitutional court, saying that it violated two principles of constitution. One is ballot secrecy and another one is universal suffrage. Obviously, this is the situation right now, and we're all I think that it will probably worsen because of these brutal laws. And what I'm worrying about is that people will lose trust in elections. People will fall in, there will be nihilism, especially in youth. There is big issue of people leaving the country. Obviously, this is going to happen because there is no chance. You cannot study, you cannot vote, your voting doesn't matter. And that's what we see right now. Hopefully, the people will understand this and will try to fight as much as they can.
Hans?
Yeah, I think those are excellent points. Let me add a few. I think I'll start with holding Western institutions to account over how they behave on Georgia. And OSCE ODIHR is an important one. I've seen, again, written accounts of short-term observers who said that the initial report, preliminary report, did not reflect what they saw, and that what they saw was a lot more intimidation. And in the meantime, what's happened is that people who kind of shared some of these concerns, they've actually been fired from ODIHR, so that there's an internal attempt to repress. That's what it looks like, to repress the view that this was not, that this is worse than described. So holding Western institutions to account is important. Let me move through a couple of other things quickly. The difficult change for a lot of people, and this is anyone who's commented on Georgia, that in the past, the idea of civil society, opposition parties was a little bit, do this so that you'll get results. And we're no longer in that world. We're now in the world where potentially you have to do certain things just because it's right. Maybe only 40 people will turn out if you do a protest every Monday, but in the end, it's the right thing to do just to signal that this stealing a country is not all right. But this is a hard change. And then I think there's a blame game, of course, going around in various ways where various people, particular minority voters, or the current focus is on the opposition. I urge people to talk about the opposition parties in plural so that we have a more nuanced analysis, are being blamed for this or that or the other. This is not constructive. And people should ask themselves, what can I do to actually contribute to a more constructive future, even if it's just a tiny thing? Rather, did these people over there let me down? So needs to be a change kind of in tone, and social media is part of the problem in how people talk about it, but it's really, really important. I would also say inept regimes and authoritarian regimes stumble. They make internal mistakes. They're vulnerable to external shocks. And when that moment comes, you won't have 3 months and conferences in Stamba and rooms to kind of for quick polemical aside that will help you prepare for that. You then need to be ready. So I do think, yes, it's hard, but to continue campaigning and actually contesting the space in a sensible way, I think remains very, very important, so that when the opportunity comes, you can take advantage of it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, and I would say to everybody listening, 2 out of 3 people who were not actually born in Georgia but who care very deeply about it. I appreciate part of the talking points of certainly the Russian-supported Otsneba party people on Facebook and everywhere else, is that whenever a foreigner says anything, to say, look, you're a foreigner, go back to wherever you come from and leave us alone. We Georgians will figure out everything on our own and whatever else. And so we appreciate those of us who are listening and who are allowing us to be involved in paying attention to Georgia. Let me just close about the language related to this election. It sort of reminds me of back in Shevardnadze era when I lived in Tatsminda. I lived across the street from what people called a children's hospital. There were no patients in that children's hospital. There were a ton of illegal electricity lines that were going to and from that hospital. The doctors would just smoke cigarettes on the balcony and take payments every once in a while and look at who was attaching a line and who hadn't paid in a while and get 10 or 20 lari here and there. The purpose of that building was to supply electricity to the neighborhood when the regular electricity went off, which was almost all the time. All right. But it was called a children's hospital, but it wasn't really a children's hospital. I mean, yeah, every once in a while, some misinformed person who had a sick kid from the village would go there and the doctors would say, I don't know, take some aspirin or try and figure out what to do with the poor kid. But it wasn't really a children's hospital. But they couldn't cut off electricity to the place because supposedly it was a children's hospital. It was just masquerading as a children's hospital, similar to these elections. These were not elections. Elections are when people choose who their leaders will be. All right. And that's not what happened here. This was a whole process by which they went through as many of the motions of an election as they could while still guaranteeing the outcome that they would remain in power. And that's not an election. You can call it a fake election. You can call it some sort of exercise in performative public loyalty to the regime. Somebody needs to figure out a new word or term for it, but they were not elections. They were not marred by violations. They just had nothing to do with an election. They were just going through the motion to pretend that there was a Democratic elected ruling party in parliament. So remember that when you're talking about what happened a few weeks ago in Georgia, and realize that it just didn't have anything to do with election other than just appearing like it. So on that sad note, and with great hopes for the continued organization of civil society in Georgia, and with thanks for those of you, Hans and Irina, and many, many others who have done their best to try to support democracy in Georgia, we'll sign off there and look forward to talking to you again. Madlo.
Madlo, thank you so much, Mark. Thanks very much, Irina.
Thank you very much, Hans and Mark. Thank you.
If you have thoughts about what we've said, questions, or other things you'd like to have a special ramble on, let us know at info@rorschach.com.